I first met Circe a little over a year, well, almost 2 years ago, I guess, because I was in Austin at the time, and Julia Coates had told me about her, and so we invited her to speak to our group down in Austin, the Central Texas Cherokee Township, and she did a presentation basically on one of her two books, um, one called uh, Becoming Indian. Um, but because I'd heard that, I asked her if if she would focus more on the Freedmen issue since it's a more current issue. Um, but anyway, just to give you a little bit of her background, she actually got her undergraduate degree at UT Austin, but then got her master's and PhD in anthropology at the University of California at Davis. Um, and was a prof at the University of Oklahoma in their anthropology department from 1997 to 2009, and has been a professor at UT Austin since that time. Um, she is in the anthropology department, but focusing on Native American studies. Um, she indicated she would probably bring this in as well, but she is of Choctaw heritage. But she has an interesting story to talk about that. Um, but anyway, she's written those two books, both of which I have, are very interesting books. Has written as is the case with most professors, has written a ton of refereed journal articles and book chapters and so on. But if anybody's interested, I have her Vita I could share with you. Um, she also has a special interest in Sicilian history, being of Sicilian ancestry herself, which I found kind of fascinating. Um, and since we'll be dealing with legal issues a bit, Cersei, I'll let you know that Bob up here in the right-hand corner um, is a former judge from Oklahoma.
Ah,
And so he knows a lot about legal issues, and I'm sure we'd have some interesting questions on
that's
those
great.
issues.
Uh, Bob, were you just a district court judge or a tribal judge or what kind of judge? There's so many.
A little both. I was district court judge in Payne County, Oklahoma,
Yeah.
and I've been an administrative law judge here in the state of Washington. And I was also on the Kickapoo Tribe of Oklahoma Supreme Court for a while.
Okay. Okay. So you're very versed in tribal law as well. That's awesome. Um, okay. So I'll just thank you for the very nice introduction. Ellis, are you done? Did you want to add anything
Yeah,
else?
that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So the only thing I would add is to say that I'm also from the get-go, in part because of my own tribal background, I trained in Native American Studies as a graduate student. So I actually got a joint degree in anthropology and Native American Studies from the University of California at Davis. And for me, that was really significant because when I was an undergrad, at UT Austin, there was no Native studies. When they did Native studies, it was all looking south of the border, right? So there was nobody who was talking about American Indian issues at all. And so that's one of the reasons why I left Oklahoma was because there was such a well-established Native studies program there, but I had an opportunity to help build one at UT, my former alma mater. And what people don't realize about Texas, and I'll just say this in passing, because people are always like, why did you leave Indian country? Well, one of the things about Texas that's interesting is that it has the fourth largest population of American Indians of any state in the United States, but no one thinks of Texas as Indian country at all, right? It's bookended by places like New Mexico, right? But people see New Mexico as a place that has American Indians, but would never think that about Texas. So it felt like it was really an important thing to do, and that has happened. So I went from Native American Studies and Anthropology, doing that as a grad student, and then teaching at the University of Oklahoma with a foot in Native American Studies and Anthropology there, and the same thing now at UT. So I just say that because my background is, even though I'm a social scientist, I'm very much lean towards the kind of humanities and have a broader, I think, a broader training that is outside of just the strict sort of social science model. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to say was how I got started with doing work in the Cherokee Nation. Part of so I started my research, my very first trip to Tahlequah was in 1993, believe it or not. So it was under Wilma's administration. And at the time, I was still a graduate student, and because of my own background, Ellis alluded to this, but I'm Mississippi Choctaw through my father's mother. But Mississippi Choctaw, uh, the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians has a half-blood quantum requirement for citizenship. So you have to be half or more, and I don't meet that requirement. And so because of that, I'm not a tribal citizen. And so I've always, sort of acknowledged that I'm a descendant, but made a very clear distinction that I'm also not a citizen, and that's a really significant distinction. But nonetheless, my personal history is part of the reason why I got interested in Native studies. And I was asking the question way back in the early 90s about what it means to have ancestry and how that gets politicized and how that's understood in different ways in terms of law, federal law, tribal law, and also how individuals interpret that within tribal nations in different ways. And so those were the kinds of questions that were stirring around inside of me. And for me, it didn't make sense to ask that question in the context of the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, because it was such a clear-cut question in that context. Whereas in a place like the Cherokee Nation or the Choctaw Nation or other nations that are originally from the Southeast that are in Oklahoma that have kind of more open enrollment policies, it made a lot of sense to ask that question in that context, to say, how do people navigate these sort of standards of citizenship and their own understandings of what this means and what's at play here. So I just say that to kind of give some context for why I ended up asking these questions in the Cherokee Nation. And then when I first went, I had these ideas that were kind of coming from my own experience, but I wanted to make sure that people in the Cherokee Nation also cared about the kinds of questions that I was interested in. So I went that summer and met with tribal officials and, had already written people and, asked to meet, and sort of went around asking for permission and kind of being sent around to various offices and education and administration and kind of out in community groups and things like that, where I could sort of solicit feedback about the kinds of questions that Cherokee citizens were interested in and that the tribal government was interested in. And so that fed into my first book, Blood Politics. And then I continued my relationship working with the Cherokee Nation and asking different questions. The second book that I did, Becoming Indian, was also one that specifically I was kind of tasked with addressing this by the Cherokee Nation administration. They said, this is something we've been watching for decades that's of concern to us, but we don't have time to make sense of all these records we've been gathering. Somebody needs to do it. You have at it. And so I did. And have presented that research at the Sequoia conference with the Cherokee Nation, where much of the tribal administration was there and tribal council members and that kind of thing. So that's just background. Does anybody have any questions about any of that before I move on to talking about other stuff? No?
Just gratitude. I'd like to express my gratitude. I ask all the same questions. I'm so glad you're here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, so let me talk about the Freedmen topic, just to kind of frame that a little bit. One of the things is that when I first started doing work in the Cherokee Nation back in the mid-90s, this topic was not as much in the public eye as it came to be in the mid-2000s and beyond. And so one of the things about that I think is important was that I was asking questions about blood belonging and descent and citizenship rules and also about race, because obviously people can have radically different, can have the same amount of ancestry, but look radically different from each other. And so siblings in the same family can be treated differently by their own family, and can also have an experience of the world that's very different based on their appearance, and yet they have the same ancestry. And so I was interested in that question of how race also kind of troubles these waters when we're talking about, ways of belonging in tribal nations. And so I felt like I couldn't address this topic in the Cherokee Nation as just a kind of like white and American Indian sort of question, because there was the history of the freedmen present, and it was there in the community. There was a small region, especially of Tahlequah, and little communities, and people talking about this group of folks that were a part of historically of the tribe. And so, so I ended up in the first book writing about the Cherokee Freedmen as a kind of as part of the story of the tribe in terms of dealing with blood politics, and so it ended up being something that I continued to pay attention to throughout my my scholarship working with the tribe. But it became very much a hot button issue much later on that had all kinds of important repercussions politically, legally for the nation. And so one of the things that I want to say is that I addressed this topic, even though it's kind of painful and sensitive, because it does significantly impact the way in which the Cherokee Nation is read in the public sphere. And it has an important legal repercussions for all of Indian country. Race in this context and how people are interpreting race really, really deeply impacts like the very idea of sovereignty for the Cherokee Nation, and the way in which the public how the public reads and views and understands Cherokees as a whole. And what the tribal government does represents all of you, and yet all of you are very different from one another. So I remember watching this controversy unfold and realizing that Cherokee citizens were being painted with as having a particular stance in the public eye, and yet there was a lot of diversity of opinion, and and people who were not participating in the political sphere who had different ideas, and so that doesn't always get represented. And so part of my feeling of why it's important to talk about this, even though it's a much more closed issue now, it's been decided legally and it's not as pressing as it was, is to just be mindful of the way that it's important to speak on these issues and to understand how they impact the nation, and also to just be aware of this history, because I think that for tribal governments, race is typically used, or hot buttons around race are typically used not to, build up governments, but to undermine them in many respects. And so this is one of those places where Cherokee, the more astute and aware Cherokee people are of this kind of context, the better able they are to weigh in terms of their own self-governance and participation in governance. So that's just my kind of, some background things that I wanted to share in terms of thinking about this topic. I'm trying to pull up something really quickly. Okay, so does that make sense to everybody as I kind of say that? The other thing too, before we launch into talking about the Cherokee Freedmen stuff more specifically, is I'm wondering how many of you had, kind of grew up with or understood who the Cherokee Freedmen were, or had heard about them before, say, 2000, or 1998. Had any of you really heard much about the Cherokee Freedmen before that?
No.
I did.
I heard some.
Who's talking right now?
So this is Josh talking. I grew up on the tall side over towards Edgar County, and I remember hearing a little bit about them. And so I kind of knew them. I didn't know the political, but I knew the history effect as them being around and how they had joined in, but wasn't really in tune to the political repercussions of that.
Yeah, yeah. So that's interesting because in Adair County, there were a lot of people who actually, talked about the freedmen as being, part of the landscape, right? So like when I did interviews in the Cherokee Nation, again, before this became such a hot topic issue back in the, 95, 96, people in Adair County in particular had more cognizance and awareness about the freedmen than in other counties. So it's kind of interesting that you mention them. A lot of it had to do with the fact that there was a lot of visiting that happened back and forth between freedmen churches and the Cherokee Baptist churches. And so there was more like kind of sharing and awareness of a kind of shared history there among that population in Adair County. So I think it's important that you brought that up. So people in the Cherokee Nation itself, depending on where they lived and who they were interacting with, had more or less awareness of this topic. But for the most part, it was, it's a small minority within the Cherokee Nation, and people had different kind of understandings of what it was about. But I will say that there were people who were very interested in talking about this history, again, before it became very like a public hot button issue, and other people who specifically asked me not to talk about it. So there was some sensitivity even early on about it. And I'll try to give you a sense of why I think that is in just a second. So anyway, go ahead.
Ask you a question? Thank you so much, first off, for being here and speaking with us. I grew up in Norman, Oklahoma, and Oklahoma, at least where I was growing up, I wasn't even aware of African Americans. I mean, I'm ashamed to say that, but I totally was unaware. And I was shocked later in life to find out about the atrocities that went on and that Norman was a lily white town. And when I moved to New York City from Norman, Oklahoma, it was a diverse population, and I loved having that diverse population. I was embracing all of that. And I moved back to Oklahoma. I was teaching at Oklahoma City University. And that whole issue of the freedmen came up with the Cherokees. And I was like, I was just totally, I didn't know anything about it. So I read as much as I could.
Yeah, yeah. Mary, it's interesting because Norman, Oklahoma was actually a sundown town. And the first African-American person who was there, I think it was quite late, maybe in the late 60s, early 70s, was a professor that had been hired by the university, an African-American professor in the context of a sundown time. So one of the things that's interesting about Oklahoma is that there are all these contested sort of vying for what the state would become. Was it going to stay Indian territory? Would it become a Black territory, a place where African Americans could kind of seek freedom away from the rest of the, in the wake of Reconstruction? Or would it be, a white state? And so we see it as something that's more complicated. But when Oklahoma became a state, it pretty much suppressed the governments, the tribal governments that had been empowered before that. So with statehood, it really is a sort of a moment in which we see the disempowerment of all these other communities in the state. So Oklahoma is de facto segregated, even still, in many respects. So it's one of the reasons why it's a place where these histories, take on some of the aspects that they do.
Circe?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Steve. I lived in Davis for 23 years until this spring. Now up in Port Townsend. Yeah, so I didn't hear about the controversy until it kind of it broke out, I guess whenever that was in the 90s or something. But certainly I was cognizant of my family history. We had various different relatives, ancestors on the Trail of Tears or before the Trail of Tears, and I know one of them had 2 slaves with them on the Trail of Tears. The wife was a Cherokee. The husband was one of the colleagues of Samuel Worcester, the white preacher, and they actually had 2 slaves. But then later on in in Indian Territory, I had some wings of the family later joined Stan Wadey with the Confederates.
Mhm.
And so I have uncles named after Confederate generals.
Yeah.
So there was like this interesting mix of things in my family history. I was always cognizant of that when that Freedmen thing broke out.
Well,
And
one
I
of the things that's
followed
kind
that
of,
closely.
yeah, it's super interesting that you're bringing up the Trail of Tears because it's so iconic for all of us that have roots in the Southeast. But what's interesting about it is that when people think about the Trail of Tears, especially for the Cherokee Nation, they never remember the fact that the slaves walked the trail as well, right? And
Yeah.
that sometimes they say the survival of families in part was dependent on whether they were slaveholding or not. So it's something to kind of think about in terms of your own family history. If they had slaves, that may have been part of the reason why they were able to survive that atrocity. But the other thing too is if you look at the kind of longue durée of Cherokee history, the issue of slavery was a divisive one always. So the Cherokee Nation at various points gets painted as if it was really pro-slavery, but the slaveholding Cherokees were always considered, you know, even if they had a lot of power because they were more economically powerful, there was always divisions within the nation from as soon as it was kind of adopted in as to whether or not slavery was, you know, something that the Cherokee was good for Cherokees or not, or, you know, was, you know, there was controversy about it from the get-go. And so I think that, you know, that controversial history, that divisive history, the very fact that Cherokees fought each other during the Civil War is something that colors and impacts still the way in which the Freedmen issue was read and understood within the Cherokee Nation. It's a longue durée. And so even though, I guess one of the things I want to say is that we think about the Freedmen issue as something that kind of like popped into public awareness and into debate within the Cherokee Nation in a kind of overt way, beginning in the late 90s and through the first decade of the 2000s until it was decided more recently. But there's actually 150 years of resistance on the part of freedmen where they were trying to get their rights acknowledged within the nation in various ways. So from 1866, from the signing of the treaty in 1866, let me back up. Does everybody know about the 1866 treaty? Or should I? Yeah, Bob?
No, I mean, I know about it, but I think it'd probably be good to give some background.
Okay.
Like a refresher.
Okay, sure. So let me kind of back up a little bit and just start with some of the basics about the Freedmen case. So in 1866, during the moment of Reconstruction post-Civil War, the Cherokee Nation signed a treaty with the US government. And that there's some controversy about how that 1866 treaty is interpreted, whether the Cherokee Nation was kind of forced under duress to sign this treaty, or whether the Cherokee Nation was able to navigate and negotiate that treaty as a kind of sovereign. So there are debates about that, and I can kind of weigh in about what I think about it. But in that 1866 treaty, that is the treaty where the Cherokee Nation formally adopts the freedmen as tribal citizens. And so the language of the treaty grants them, you know, full tribal citizenship. And so it's very common that nations, no matter what nation we're talking about, not just tribal nations, that nations where there was a history of slavery have to deal with this history of slavery, and that they usually deal with the issue of slavery once it's abolished by granting citizenship to the former enslaved. So that's, you know, it's not unusual that the Cherokee Nation did that, but what is unusual about it is that they actually abolished slavery before the U.S. government, you know, before the U.S. government abolished slavery. The Cherokee Nation ended it, and the Cherokee Nation did not resist. Like there were other tribes you know, who were having to negotiate these treaties with the federal government that did not agree to adopt their slaves. So one of the more famous examples of that is the Chickasaws never agreed to adopt their former slaves. And so those people, those Chickasaw freedmen, ended up being people without a homeland, without a country, that were kind of stuck in this in-between place. Whereas the Cherokee Nation did adopt their citizens with this Treaty of 1866 and actually proceeded to include them, offer education, and there was more political participation on the part of freedmen in tribal governance and in various ways from the early days. So that's that's an important part of history. The other thing I wanted to do was to kind of show you guys, I don't know if I can pull this up very, is there a way where I can share screen? Ellis or Joseph?
Joseph is our expert on that.
Joseph, do you know if I can share
Absolutely.
screen?
Let me make it absolutely. Let me make you the presenter real quickly.
Okay. I just have some images that I wanted to share with you guys.
How did the Chickasaw get away with it? If that's the right term.
Yeah, it's interesting because they're the only ones who did, and they just refused. So this is the thing that's interesting, is like a lot of people say that the Cherokee Nation was forced to do this, but the Chickasaw were a much less powerful tribe than the Cherokee Nation, smaller in number, less influential. And so if the Chickasaw were able to resist this, then I have a hard time accepting that the Cherokee Nation didn't willingly choose to do this, right? I have a hard time, like that history doesn't make sense to me given the relative. So it means that the Chickasaw were empowered enough that they could say no, and that certainly the Cherokee Nation would assumably be negotiating with the same parties and same context and could have said no, but they chose not to,
Yeah.
right? Now, the Cherokee Nation didn't, when I say that there was 150 years of resistance on the part of freedmen, it's that the freedmen felt like they were citizens, but they were second-class citizens. They were still in segregated schools. They didn't always get, quite as much as other tribal citizens. So they were being attended to, but they felt like they were not quite fully enfranchised citizens. And so there was this effort over many, many years to make sure that they were participating fully. And there were different sort of histories of that resistance, but you can find stuff from the 40s, the 50s, the 20s, the 1900s, where freedmen were advocating for their own rights in the Cherokee Nation. They weren't considered non-citizens during that time. They were just considered to be not fully enfranchised citizens in the way that other people were. And their legal rights were that they should have been treated as the same as everybody else. Now, part of the problem goes back to the Dawes rolls, and I'll talk about that, and I'll go ahead and talk about that right now. But
Wait, can I ask a
sure,
question
Steve.
that just a little bit before the Dawes rolls? So I've always assumed, but I could be wrong, so I'm going to ask you. I've always assumed that the split in the Cherokee Nation, say in 1860s, between the treaty party, the stand-weighty group and the other group over was correlated with their side in the Civil War, and then was correlated with their approach toward the freedmen. Would that be an oversimplification, or would that be accurate?
So you're saying after removal?
Yeah,
The period after removal?
like in terms of how they approached the Civil War, in terms of taking sides,
Yeah.
and which side they took, and because it was split, and then presumably their approach toward the freedmen question.
Yeah, so I think it's not quite that simple. One of the things is, if you look at what historians have done with the records, is historians tend to paint a more a simplistic picture. And the simplistic picture that historians would tend to provide is that the divisions, you know, and I think it's simplistic both before removal and after removal, but the simplistic version, and this is, I don't agree with, but I'm just going to tell you what's out there, is that prior to removal, it was, you know, pro-slavery and anti-slavery Cherokees, and that corresponded with wealth and whether people were mixed bloods or full bloods. So the idea was that pro-slavery Cherokees tended to be mixed blood, more assimilated and wealthier, and that anti-slavery Cherokees tended to be full bloods and poorer and, you know, anti-slavery. I don't know if I said that, poor and anti-slavery and full blood. And that's not right, because for instance, Stan Wadey, who you've mentioned a couple times, was full blood Cherokee and also very wealthy and also pro-slavery, right? So it doesn't correspond. That's a gross generalization, right? So so it's there. What it had to do with more was what people believed were the actual values of the Cherokee Nation. And so it is true that people who held on to kind of cultural values that were tied to, say, clan identity and belonging would tend to kind of read belonging in different ways than, say, someone who was, you know, a little bit more assimilated. So slavery and who people are gets interpreted through very, very different cultural lenses than what we can imagine right now, if that makes sense. So it's really like, you know, it really was like, who was your mother? What language did you speak? How do you live? What religion do you practice? How do you dress? Who do you live alongside with and share community with? And so that was, and we did see full-blood Cherokees who were slaveholders, but a lot of times they would just be slaveholders of a single family and would have a very different relationship with that family than what we would see in any kind of plantation style slavery. So I think that the divisions had to do with more with a kind of orientation towards, is this economically, this kind of white system of economic sustenance through slavery, something that's good for the nation and something that Cherokees do, or is it something that we shouldn't do, right? So it was a kind of more complex question that had to do with value systems that were attached to what that brought in and what it didn't bring in. And people kind of fell on different sides of it. So yes, in a broad sense, some of that's true, but it gets more complicated when you start looking at the details of the history. I don't know if that's very helpful.
Thank you.
Sure, Steve.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment. I agree with what you said on that, that it's not simple. And I mean, for instance, John Ross, who was an 8th Cherokee, so he was definitely not a full blood. Had a lot. It was one of the larger slaveholders. So it didn't, you know, pure division between the anti-treaty and the treaty group as far as slavery, non-slavery, Union, Confederate. The other thing is, I'm also Chickasaw, and I am curious about the, you know, that angle, how the Chickasaws were able to navigate and negotiate the freedmen out when it's a much smaller group than the Cherokees were.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I've not researched that. I just know that was, you know, that's been the outcome, but I can't quite make sense of how they were able to do that, and the Cherokees weren't, unless that isn't what the Cherokees wanted to do.
Right.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
did read one interesting excerpt that said that many of the Chickasaw slaves were actually adopted by the Choctaws and given citizenship within the Choctaw Nation.
Mhm.
That could have been because the Chickasaws and Choctaws were at one time the same tribe. You know, then they
Yeah.
split, and when they came to Oklahoma, the Choctaws actually had that whole southeast quadrant of the state, and then the Chickasaws bought half of it and kind of split up. But for a long time, the Chickasaws and the Choctaws were sort of under the same roof.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have that origin story about putting a pole in the ground and it falling, and that half the people went one direction, half the people went another direction. So like read the pole in different ways, you know. So I do think that, yeah, I mean, it's like you can see that the Chickasaw government just resisted over and over again, and the Cherokee Nation did not. The Cherokee emancipated their slaves early. They were not forced to emancipate their slaves. They did it before the US did. And then they made this decision, you know, that the Chickasaw did not make. So to me, it's a sign of their capacity. And you can look through the records and just see, you know, that there's you know, testimony and resistance on the part of the Chickasaw over and over again, where they just never agree to do it. But it is, I think, if you know, being Cherokee and Chickasaw, it's an interesting question to kind of delve into some of that and look at it. But so one of the things, Joseph, did you make me able to share screen?
I did. And look at the bottom of your screen, you should have a toolbar with the share icon.
Yeah.
You push share, it's going to show a bunch of boxes, and you can pick which box you want to share.
Okay, I'm looking at it right now. It's weird because it's saying it's not lit up as if I can share it. So I've got a share button in the middle, but when I, let me try this again.
It's right next to the mute button.
Yeah, I've got
Stop
mute,
video,
stop.
then share.
Right, but mine is not highlighted. It's asking me to open system preferences. So, oh, it's saying I have to let you record the computer screen, but let's see if I can do this. Oh, no, it's asking me to leave the meeting. Darn it. I have a bunch of historical photos of the freedmen that I wanted to share with you guys, and I don't know if I can do that right now. It seems like it's trying to kick me out. So it wants me to allow me to record in order to be able to share, and for some reason I'm not able to do that, which is kind of a bummer because I put that together.
Well, so Dr. Sturm, if you just quickly email them to me, I can bring them up for you from here. That might be a workaround.
It's in a PowerPoint. So if I'm
I can open PowerPoint.
Okay. Oh no, I'm sorry. It's in a Prezi presentation, not a PowerPoint. Do you have a Prezi account? Probably not, right?
No.
Okay. It says allow WebEx meetings to record your computer screen so that you can share content in meetings. And so let's see, screen recording. I'm going to try this one last time, and if it doesn't work, then I'm going to move on so we can not lose too much time. Okay. So, yeah, for some reason, it's telling me I need to allow for recording, and I've unlocked it and tried to do it, but it's for some reason not giving me this option. All right. Well, I think I'm just going to give up on that. I'm sorry.
Well, you could also share your screen instead of just the presentation. That might make it a little easier for you.
Well, that's what I'm trying to do, but when the share button is not lit up on my screen. You see what I'm saying? It's there, but it's dim. So it's like not enabled so that I can share, if that makes sense. Typically, it would be like lit up so that I could hit it, like stop my video and it'd allow me, but all it is it's dimmed out and says when I hover over it, it says open system preferences. So I don't think there is a way. And you made me a host?
I made you presenter. I can actually make you host as well.
I wonder if you make me a host if it'll let me do it.
You're now a host and have presenter privileges, so we've got all the keys.
Yeah, and I still don't have I still have a thing saying allow WebEx meetings to record your computer screen so that you can share content in meetings. And it's recording and I've allowed it and it's not letting me unless there's something I'm doing wrong.
There's a switch in or a setup that I'm sorry I don't know how to explain to you yet too, because I'm not sure where it would be either.
Yeah, I'm looking at screen recording, automation, accessibility, input monitoring. Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't want to take more time away from us. So I'll try to get those images and send them to you guys because they're pretty interesting. But for now, I'm just not I'm gonna give up on that for right now. Okay, so part of what I wanted to say was that we have this Treaty of 1866. It's the moment of Reconstruction. Cherokee Nation has abolished slavery, and the Cherokee Nation has to begin pretty soon thereafter to negotiate with the Dawes Commission. I mean, of course, there are a couple of decades, but during that intermediary period between the Treaty of 1866 and the time of the Dawes Commission, we do see members of the freedmen community actually participating very much in the life of the Cherokee Nation. There's actually a council member who's a freedman who was important to so there was leadership in the Cherokee Nation from the freedmen. There were people who were, participating, living, in the life of the Cherokee Nation. There's a fair amount of evidence that there were, decades there where people were participating and the Cherokee Nation was providing for schools for freedmen children. So there were all kinds of things that were happening in that intervening period. And it's also a period when the Cherokee Nation is itself recovering from the war and trying to rebuild itself and stay on its feet. So it's kind of a period when the Cherokee Nation is in recovery, and yet it's still attending to this part of its citizenry. So things get more complicated with the Dawes Commission. We know that the Dawes Commission really undermines the Cherokee Nation in a lot of ways. And the main way it does so is through the dissolution of the tribal land base, right? And everybody understands how that, does everybody understand how that process happened, where the tribal land base was lost with the Dawes Commission in many respects?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think most of us do see how we had this,
Yep.
when you move to individual ownership, you can assign people a certain amount of land and then, free up the rest for, other people to take it. And that's basically what happened. It was an effort to, one of the side effects of that was to kind of try to get tribes to move towards individual land ownership and not collective land ownership. And so in that process, when the Dawes Commission happens and the Cherokee citizenry is identified in order to determine who would get allotments, the Dawes Commission makes the base rolls for what are considered to be the base rolls that are used to determine Cherokee citizenship today. But what's important about those base rolls is you have not only Cherokees by blood, right? But we also have intermarried whites. So a lot of times people forget that there's a white roll in terms of the Dawes rolls. And there's also the kind of black roll, which was the Cherokee Freedmen roll. What's important about the Freedmen roll is that there were, if you look You don't see this when you look at just the Freedmen roll itself. You have to go dig around in the Dawes enrollment cards. So I'm sure some of you have looked at these Dawes enrollment cards for your own family because they have more information, right? But on the Dawes enrollment cards that were used for the Cherokee Freedmen, you see a lot more information about who people are. And so some portion of the Freedmen apparently did not have Cherokee ancestry. So some portion does not have a Cherokee ancestry that shows up in any way on the Dawes Rolls enrollment cards. But a good portion does actually have Cherokee ancestry. And so there's a significant number that have siblings that are on the by blood rolls, or they have relatives that were on the by blood rolls, or relatives that were Cherokee Indian, you know, but they themselves, largely due to appearance, are being listed on the Freedmen rolls, right? So it ends up where their appearance is kind of how people get slotted rather than what their actual ancestry is. So the impact of that is not only did the Cherokee Freedmen get different allotments as a result of that, but they get put into this class of citizenry where it's not acknowledging that they could have just as easily been on the by blood rolls, but they weren't. They were put into a separate class. And that has a lot to do with, you know, the fact that it was outsiders that were imposing these kind of categories of enrollment and creating the roles to begin with, even though it was Cherokees themselves who were testifying and bringing forward information about who belonged on what role and who didn't, right? Does that all make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So if we fast forward to, you know, kind of 20th century politics in the Cherokee Nation, what we see is that the Cherokee Nation continued in the early part of the 20th century to see freedmen as a class of citizens. And but at the same time, there's a bunch of legal stuff where those citizens, those freedmen, are trying to vie for full inclusion, full enfranchisement, that kind of thing. But just to give you something that I think is a very important tell, is that if we look at the elections for principal chief that were going on in the early 80s, principal chief candidates went to freedmen communities and actually campaigned in freedmen communities because freedmen were still voting. Not very many Cherokee people realized that, but people like Agnes Cowan and folks who were running for tribal office would go to freedmen communities and actually campaign to get their vote. Okay, this was true in the late 70s. This is like after the Cherokee Nation kind of re-emerges as a kind of powerful force in this part in northeastern Oklahoma, where we start to see governance looking, you know, like it does in a way that's more familiar to us. In those early days, freedmen were still had their tribal enrollment cards and were still able to vote. And we have some of these people who later resisted with like Nero and other cases legally in the court systems. They were able to show their early enrollment cards from, you know, the 1970s, the 1980s, where they were going to vote, right, in those early days. So what happened was that in around 1983, I believe it was 1983, the Cherokee Tribal Council decided at that point in time to, and this is the origin of the controversy with the Cherokee Freedmen that kind of haunted the Cherokee Nation more recently. So back in 1983, when people were campaigning for the office of principal chief, there was this kind of fear, and it's not unlike what we heard more recently. There was this fear that the incumbent candidate for principal chief was going to get you know, lose office due to the Cherokee Freedmen vote. And so it was at that time, it was kind of politics, kind of backroom politics, but the Cherokee Tribal Council annotated the Cherokee National Code. This is without bringing it to a vote of the people or anything, but they just kind of made an amendment to the Cherokee National Code and added this section 12. And the section 12 was something that would be the source of controversy much later. But they basically said in that new section where they annotated the Cherokee National Code that tribal membership derived only through proof of Cherokee blood based on the final rolls, okay? So if you look at the Cherokee Constitution says you have to be a descendant from the Dawes rolls. But that thing that was added in 1983 to that annotation to the Cherokee National Code specified a blood requirement. So that's where we get into the rub, because with freedmen, you have some people who have Cherokee ancestry that are classified as not having Cherokee ancestry on this particular roll. And so they can't prove their Cherokee ancestry because they're not descendants from the blood Dawes roll, right? They can prove Cherokee ancestry going back in other ways, but they can't, they're on the wrong roll to begin with if you impose that kind of blood-based final roll as the determining factor. Everybody following that? So what happens is pretty soon thereafter, in the late 80s, we see freedmen turning out again. You know, they had voted in 1983, and they come back and they go to vote again, and they show up at the rolls to go cast at the polls to go cast their vote like they'd done before, and they're turned away because there's this new code in place that says they're not citizens. And they're like, what do you mean we're not citizens? We've been voting members of this community from, you know, ever since. And they're like, no, you can't vote. And so that sparked resistance when they got turned away from the polls and they couldn't participate. And so you saw freedmen starting to, you know, organize themselves and to try, and this is long before the more recent examples that we had, where the freedmen were resisting, trying to, you know, get their full rights to be voting members of the nation. So the freedmen organized, but they were kind of stuck because of the way tribal law works and the way federal Indian law works. And Bob can probably weigh in on this as well, and some of the rest of you may be able to as well. But they were stuck in the sense that if they brought the case to the Cherokee courts, right, the Cherokee Supreme Court, and had it weighed in Cherokee courts, they were concerned about racial discrimination in the Cherokee courts, right? Because that was the place where they were already, you know, there was already this thing that was kind of passed that they weren't comfortable with. But if they went outside and tried to seek, you know, a solution in, you know, federal district courts or, you know, the US government courts, then you're kind of undermining tribal sovereignty on the one hand, because they're going outside tribal law. And so they're undermining the very thing that they're interested in. But they also keep running into the fact that the federal government, anytime it weighs in about this decision, says, you know, this is an intra-tribal dispute, and we don't actually have authority to make this decision, right? So what happened was that the Cherokee Freedmen were kind of stuck. They weren't able to get, you know, their case in tribal court kept being sort of pushed off, not decided for, you know, they couldn't get a remedy in tribal court. And so they kept going outside of the court, but every time they'd go outside the court, they'd say, we can't weigh in and make this decision because it's a Cherokee on Cherokee decision, right? So the outsiders saw it as being, this is an internal tribal dispute. We can't weigh in because tribes get to decide their own citizenry. That was the kind of basic, I'm summarizing it without getting into too much of the details, but that was the basic kind of issue. And that continued to be the issue. Those issues continued to kind of plague this, you know, this topic in many respects. So the first time this does get a proper hearing in the Cherokee with the Cherokee Supreme Court, the decision was made to determine freedmen citizenship on a case-by-case basis. So there was not a class decision made. There was the first initial decision made by the Cherokee Supreme Court was that there's an issue here, but we can't say that as a whole all these people belong. We're just going to make a decision on a case-by-case basis. But that really put the onus on the individual Cherokee freedmen that they had to be able to find all the documents and come before the tribal court for each and every one of them that wanted to, reinstate their rights to full citizenship, rather than protecting them as a class or dealing with this issue as a broader issue. So finally, the issue goes back after a bunch of legal wrangling in 2006 to the Cherokee Supreme Court. And at that point in time, it finally gets fully heard and decided. And part of what delayed it was just tribal politics. There was a bunch of upheaval in terms of, various, elections and things going on in the Cherokee Nation, but it kept being kind of put off because it was a hot button issue. But in 2006, the Supreme Court finally weighs in on this issue. And it says, basically, the Chief Justice at the time is Stacey Leeds, who many of you may know because she ran for Principal Chief afterwards. But Stacey Leeds was, a lawyer, a professor, and she was the sitting Cherokee Supreme Court Justice at the time, and she wrote the lead opinion. And she basically said that if you look to Cherokee law and the Cherokee Constitution, in the Cherokee Constitution, there is no clause that specifies that you're a citizen, you have to be a citizen by blood. She says it's just not there. And it's important to recognize that if you look back at the long array of Cherokee history, the Cherokee Nation has been a diverse place from the get-go. There has been the adoption of other American Indians into the tribe, the adoption of intermarried whites into the tribe, the adoption of eventually of the freedmen into the tribe. So the Cherokee Nation was always a kind of diverse polity, right? It didn't have this like narrow definition of we are only, obviously it's also a nation of family, right? And I'm not saying that kinship and ancestry isn't critical. You all know that it is, right? You reckon each other through family, right? That's the first thing, like who's your family? Where are they from? Tell us that. We know that that's fundamental, but it wasn't the only way that the Cherokee Nation operated. So when this decision is made, there's a long historical precedent, and there's a reason why the Cherokee Constitution didn't specify by blood in that day. So basically, the decision in 2006 was that Section 12 was unconstitutional according to the Cherokee Nation's own law. So when Stacey Leeds made that decision, it created controversy in the Cherokee Nation. And there were some segments of the Cherokee Nation that fully supported that decision and that felt like this was clarifying an issue that, long needed clarifying, and that it made perfect sense, and they agreed with it. And so there was definitely support for freedmen in some segments of the Cherokee Nation. And in fact, when I was doing interviews with people before this became so political, a lot of times it was community people who were in the 14 counties who would say to me that they had deep, long connections with that population and felt like they were an important part of the nation, right? Like in Adair County, there was a lot of people who would come forward and say that. So when it got more politicized, it became something else where there was a lot of seeds of confusion that were happening and things like that. So what happened was the Cherokee Nation in response to this, not everyone, but some of the leadership of the Cherokee Nation began to advocate and that the freedmen, that citizenship was something that had to be determined by the Cherokee population as a whole, and that there needed to be a special election and a vote so that all Cherokee citizens could weigh in on this topic, right? Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but it does send a signal to the greater public that when you make this decision to include your Black citizens formally, and then you say, wait, let's have a special election and see if we really want to do that, it sends this signal to the broader public, right? The other thing that was happening was that Chad Smith, who was principal chief at the time in 2006, really believed that the freedmen would vote against him. And he was politically kind of manipulating the situation. He was making statements going around on a kind of campaign saying that the freedmen had been paid off, like had received slave reparations when they got allotments. That's not true. They never got allotments as slave reparations. They got allotments because they were considered citizens of the nation, just like everybody else did. That's as absurd as saying that any one of your families got an allotment because they were slaves. They weren't. They were in the same category of being not former slaves that were getting allotments, but citizens of the nation that were recognized and getting allotments. But it was spun that way, right? He also would say publicly that they hadn't participated in the life of the community for 150 years. But there's overwhelming evidence that the freedmen, ran for office, they held office, they attended schools, they continued to speak the language, they had their own Cherokee Freedmen churches, they participated in religious and social sharing in the life of the community. They were marginalized in some ways, but even when the Cherokee Nation was building IHS clinics, freedmen were volunteering to help build, right? So there's a long history of participation in language classes and all kinds of things that were a part of the life of the community that are well documented. But that's not what was being told to the Cherokee population at large. What the administration was doing was kind of putting a spin on things. And it was really unfortunate because it created a lot, and there was a lot of, former Deputy Chief Ketcher was putting news, ads in the paper that were misleading. So there was a lot of misinformation, kind of spun information that was coming out that confused the issue for tribal citizens. And this is one of the reasons why we know that any government politics, right? The Cherokee Nation is not unusual in that, right? Every government has its political things, but this is one of the reasons why you need a really informed citizenry in any nation to be able to participate with full knowledge of what's going on. And so we have the issue that these stories are kind of swept under the rug anyway by the forces of history, but then they get spun in particular ways because of political issues later on. And there were things that were circulating publicly that were, unfortunately, some of them like explicitly extremely racist that got in the eyes of the broader U.S. public. And I don't know if did any of you see the thing that was from Darren Buzzard? Anybody see that statement that was circulating around? So I say this because I want to give you a sense of like what can happen when the issue of race or racism or perceived racism gets broadcast in the broader public sphere. So Darren Buzzard, who was a tribal employee at the time, wrote this thing that said, don't let the freedmen, I'm paraphrasing it, I have it, I could read it to you directly if you wanted me to, but I'm just going to paraphrase it right now. But he basically said, don't let these people suck you dry. They're a threat. Basically, he said that they were a threat to Cherokee women's virtue, which is like, I should probably find the quote because I want you to know what was, if I can find it, what was so inflammatory. If I can find it.
came straight from the Klan.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, I've got it here. Yeah, this is what he said. He said, this is a quote. It was a disturbing letter that that was circulating among the tribal council that came from a Cherokee Nation employee. And it says, quote, "Don't get taken advantage of by these people. They will suck you dry. Don't let Black freedmen back you into a corner. Protect Cherokee culture for our children, for our daughters. Fight against the infiltration." That's what he wrote. And of course, that feels very much like someone who's like bringing up the daughters. It feels very like sort of Klan language. That gets circulated in the broader public. At the same time that you have a former deputy chief printing stuff in the newspaper. Let's see if I can find this. And this is from former Deputy Chief Ketcher. He writes, quote, "When a group of non-Indians wants to be Cherokees, not having a drop of Cherokee blood, and take away the few benefits that are left, it is an issue of enough is enough. Many Cherokees don't want non-Indians claiming to be Cherokee. Many Cherokees don't want to wait in longer lines for services from the Cherokee Nation. Many Cherokees don't want to have to wait longer at the Indian hospital because of 40,000 non-Indians using the facilities. Many Cherokees want the Cherokee Nation to be an Indian tribe made up of Indians, just like every other tribe in the United States." So I'm reading you that stuff for a couple of reasons. One is to give you the ground for understanding why there becomes a public outcry, but also to realize that it's very, very important that in this rhetoric, political rhetoric that's going on, and in the actual materials, you can go back and find some of these that were circulating from the tribal government. There were materials that the tribal government was preparing for Cherokee Nation citizens about the vote, and it kept using this language about the freedmen of being non-Indians, saying non-Indians are knocking at our door. And one of the things that I want to say is really important about this is that on what basis do you determine that the freedmen are non-Indians? Like, being Indian we know is not inherently about race. It's about citizenship, it's about participation, it's about, yes, it's about family, but it's also, it's all these other things, right? Like, to some extent, you can say you can be Indian by adoption. You can be Indian by political affiliation. You can be Indian because you speak the language and you grew up where that was your main way of understanding the world. You can be Indian, in all kinds of ways. And so using that language of non-Indian was something that really politicized the situation in a way that was unfortunate and created a lot of confusion and upset, right? If you're a tribal nation and suddenly somebody's saying, well, non-Indians want to be a part of you, it makes you go, what the heck, what are we talking about here, right? It raises a lot of questions. So what happened was when this kind of rhetoric was being made very public on the part of the Cherokee Nation, it got the attention of U.S. Congresswoman Diane Watson, and she and the Congressional Black Caucus, the U.S. Congressional Black Caucus, got involved in Cherokee Nation politics at this point because they saw this as an issue of civil rights. And one of the things that's really important is to realize that this became a debate about the civil rights more broadly at the federal level and tribal sovereignty, as if the two were completely in conflict with one another. Now, a lot of people don't realize this, but if we look at federal Indian law, technically it is the highest law of the land. It predates the rights of sovereignty specifically predates U.S. sovereignty, because tribal sovereignty pre-exists and is inherent with tribal nations prior to U.S. sovereignty. So what that means is that tribal constitutions, tribal sovereignty does not have to technically, legally conform to the US Constitution, because the US Constitution is secondary. It happens after the fact. But we also know that in practice, that is not what happens. That is not how law is interpreted, right? That sovereignty itself is something that we can think of as being inherent in the people and predating and pre-existing, being the highest law of the land. But we also know that in practice, sovereignty is something that you can't just declare yourself a sovereign. You have to be recognized as a sovereign. And the recognition of those rights of sovereignty involves some amount of kind of politicking, right? So what happens is when the Cherokee Nation officials start to engage, or some segments of the Cherokee Nation start to kind of broadcast this very racist language, it creates this controversy in the public sphere where people begin to question the rights of sovereignty of the Cherokee Nation. They say, this is no longer a people who are there's an assumption that only white people can be racist. Well, that's not true. Anybody could be racist, right? There's internalized racism, everybody can be. It's not just the province of whiteness. But these kinds of language, when it sounds like the KKK, then suddenly people start to write in the public sphere or to respond in the public sphere and see the Cherokee Nation as being racist. It starts to feel like Governor Wallace standing on the steps of the courthouse in Little Rock, Arkansas, right? And so people get up in arms about this issue. And so what we started to see was a local issue for the Cherokee Nation, and an important issue, start to undermine the very fabric of sovereignty of not only the Cherokee Nation, but all Indian nations. Because suddenly, if the federal government uses this as an excuse, Congresswoman Diane Watson put forward a bill that would terminate the Cherokee Nation's recognition, basically. It felt like termination. It was going to withdraw funding and say that until the Cherokee Nation adopted its, fully enfranchised the freedmen, that it would not, benefit from its federal relationship with the US government, because it would be in violation of its treaty. Now, obviously, the US government has violated every treaty in the book, right? And so to hold the Cherokee Nation up to that standard is ironic and problematic and ignores the long array of history. But that's what was happening. So it became this issue where all of Indian country was looking at what was happening with the Cherokee Nation and going, oh my God, if this happens like this, it undermines all of our sovereignty, because suddenly outsiders are coming in and weighing in over the issue of racial politics and determining who the Cherokee Nation citizens are, right? So this is part of the reason why there was so much controversy, so much concern, so many things that were heated that were going on in the Cherokee Nation. Part of what triggered this debate was the Cherokee Nation did have a special election. That's what all the public, that happened in 2007. There was so much confusion and controversy. Only a very small percentage of the less than a quarter of people participated in the election, even though it was a super important issue. And those that did participate, the ones that did participate, the overwhelming majority voted in favor of changing the tribal citizenship requirements to be by blood. But that was one of the things that, I look at this and think about, is that there is a kind of long, deep history in the Cherokee Nation of a kind of harmony ethic, which is that you don't, when things are super controversial and heated like this, people don't engage in the fray. They express their displeasure by not participating, by not voting. They're like, I'm not gonna, that's a matter that I'm not gonna participate in. And it's a kind of vote in and of itself, but that's part of what happened. Is that's a very old, you know, sort of traditional value about maintaining harmony that has this kind of repercussion in terms of political participation at times. So when that happened, this is one of the reasons why we start to see, you know, more injunctions, the Cherokee Freedmen going back into the federal courts, Congresswoman Watson and the Congressional Black Caucus getting involved, you know, all of this like deep controversy that happened in the wake of that special election. The National Congress of the American Indians was very concerned about what was happening, about the dangerous precedent that was coming from the Congressional Black Caucus, trying to override tribal sovereignty. So again, it was, you know, a kind of civil rights versus tribal sovereignty debate, and that's part of the reason why it was so nasty. And we did see, if you looked at what was happening outside of the Cherokee Nation, there was a lot of negativity, people saying very problematic things about who Cherokees were and making sort of assumptions based on this smaller minority that had voted and had been so vocal in terms of these issues in the Cherokee Nation. I will say, just to give you a sense of, you know, what was going on, I think it was the maybe 2007 Cherokee National Holiday, that when I was in the midst of all this controversy, there was resistance that was happening, right? So the public saw this kind of, you know, racist version of things. But when you were there at the Cherokee National Holidays, there were artists who were creating all these artworks that included freedmen in terms of their public representations of who Cherokees were. They were talking about shoe boots and particular political leaders, and they were doing artwork that included freedmen as a part of the history. There was a Cherokee Freedmen float where the freedmen were like out in the parade and sort of saying, you know, they had little kids out there saying, we're Cherokee too, and people were really moved. I mean, there were other public voices that weren't being heard by outsiders, but that were part of what was going on the ground. So I want to say that even as I'm pointing to these things that got all this national attention and that were really troubling, there were also a lot of Cherokee people at home that were resisting that kind of racist discourse and being more inclusive and fighting for the rights of freedmen locally and trying to kind of band together and get this dealt with, and who saw, you know, that this was setting a really dangerous precedent and were concerned about it.
Can I ask a favor of someone who's typing to mute their call, please?
So, so I think that so what happened is that basically things kind of stood in this. There was this moment where things were kind of uncomfortable, and it ended up where you know, the decision regarding this was brought forward to the federal courts again, and it kind of languished and was not decided for some time. And so what happened was that you know, the freedmen were in this kind of in-between category where they were sort of on hold waiting for their case to be decided, but it wasn't until 2017 that the decision was finally made in the U.S. District Court. So it was in August of 2017. So, you know, for years, it just kind of sat there languishing, waiting for people to reach a decision. Unless the Cherokee Nation was willing to temporarily kind of recognize and work with the freedmen, they were being kind of held hostage by the federal courts and, you know, and by the threats of the Black Congressional Congress. And so it was kind of a tricky time where this sort of sat there and the Cherokee Nation was in a holding pattern and was still kind of resisting. But in late August of 2017, the U.S. District Court finally made a ruling that according to Article 9 in the Cherokee Treaty of 1866, that the freedmen had rights of citizenship that were equal to those of native Cherokees. But in that decision, the court also affirmed the Cherokee Nation's right to determine its own standards of citizenship. But it said that it must do so with respect to both native Cherokees and Cherokee Freedmen descendants. So it's basically the court was saying you have the right to, rights of sovereignty, determine that that's a fundamental principle of sovereignty, but you can't just suddenly overrule a whole class of citizens, right? It was a complicated ruling in many respects, but in a way, it's it was a ruling that tried to both protect the rights of citizenship of the freedmen as a part of the citizenry of the Cherokee Nation, but also to protect the principle of tribal sovereignty at the same time. And so since that ruling, what happened was the Cherokee Nation, once that ruling was made, decided not to appeal. Finally, the decision was finally made at that. It had appealed every decision that had been made before that. And it finally got to this point where it was decided in 2017, the Cherokee Nation said, we're not going to appeal this. And so when it decided not to file an appeal, that was the moment when this decision was over. And ever since then, citizenship applications for freedmen descendants have been accepted, processed, and there has been an increasing tendency, an ever more frequent tendency on the part of the Cherokee tribal government to acknowledge freedmen histories, to reach out to these communities, to see them as a part of the broader citizenship of the Cherokee Nation. There's been more participation on the part, again, of freedmen in the life of the Cherokee Nation's, sort of self-governance. So there's a lot that can be said about this, but that was, mainly the kind of gist of what I wanted to talk about in terms of thinking about your own relationship to this, where you got your knowledge from, why it's important for you to know your own history, how knowledge about history impacts your ability to make informed decisions in the present, being aware of how tribal sovereignty can get undermined in the public sphere, particularly around questions of race. I mean, it could be undermined because suddenly the federal government would decide that the Cherokee Nation isn't Indian enough, right? There are all kinds of ways that this could happen, right? In this case, the Cherokee Nation was being punished for being perceived to be racist, right? The actions of a few were like kind of painted across the Cherokee Nation as a whole, even though it was a more complicated picture, but that's how the public saw it. So I think that was the main reason why I thought it was important to talk about this issue. I think I've been talking for a long time now. My apologies. That's the basics. Anybody have any questions? Or
some of the information I read indicated that even Main Killer was more on the side of restricting freedmen. Is that your take on that?
I think that he changed. So part of the reason is that Wilma Mankiller had a very close relationship with Chad Smith. She was the one who wanted Chad Smith back when he was just a lawyer to run for office. And so I think that there was also this kind of deeper concern coming from Chad and from Wilma that if the Cherokee Nation, this is my interpretation, so they did not say this to me specifically, but the Cherokee Nation already, despite the diversity, despite how many people speak Cherokee, how alive the life of the community and culture is, and all these ways of being and doing that are so profoundly Cherokee, the Cherokee Nation gets read by outsiders often as being a white Indian nation, a white tribe, right? A whitened or assimilated tribe, or a tribe where people are not fully Indian anymore. There's some controversy around that. And so there's a feeling that there's a little bit of a danger in that perception because of the way politics and recognition work. And I think that there was a fear that if the Cherokee Nation suddenly had Black citizens as well, that might also undermine its status as an American Indian tribe. And I don't think that's the case. I think it brought up a whole different set of issues, but I think that was part of the concern, possibly, or maybe a kind of unconscious part of the concern. Does that make sense, what I'm suggesting to people? Yeah.
Yeah.
This is one of those issues where race, when people equate Indianness with race and not with like citizenship or cultural belonging or other things, that we run into trouble. I think you had a question, Steve?
Yeah, so the federal ruling, was it based primarily on the tribe defining its membership in a way that violated civil rights, or was it based primarily on the fact that the tribe had signed a treaty in 1866 that acknowledged that the freedmen would be citizens?
It was based on the treaty.
It was based on the treaty. That's what I thought.
Yeah. So when they fought the case in court, it was primarily the way in which they could get federal attention was to say that this was a treaty violation.
Right.
Because the treaty is pretty clear. But they also made the case, so like in the Cherokee Supreme Court, they argued that it was a violation of the Constitution, the Cherokee Constitution. In the federal courts, they argued that it was a violation of the treaty.
Right.
And so that was the basis.
So second question, since this whole thing kind of came about in the 80s or 90s because the election was perceived to be very close, and that the freedmen potentially represented enough of a swing vote that they could affect the election result. What do we know today? Is that still the case? Is there still tension over that? Do they even vote as a bloc? How do things fall today? And I guess the obvious question, I realize that the Southern Democrats are now Republicans, and in the 80s they were still Democrats, but how does that map on to today's parties?
Yeah, great question, Steve. So part of the reason people argue that part of the reason that Chad Smith was pushing to exclude the freedmen was because, or politicking against their formal recognition, was because he was running against Stacey Leeds. And Stacey Leeds was the one who had written the decision in the Cherokee Supreme Court in favor of the freedmen. So she had the freedmen's support. And so it was, people kept saying it's history replaying itself. The same thing where, the election for principal chief is being seen in, the 80s as being something that could be skewed by the freedmen vote. It was being read that way again in the 2006 election. So there are potentially 40,000 descendants that descend from the freedmen rolls. They're not all enrolled, but that's just like the potential number, right? And so if they chose to all vote in a block and there isn't adequate participation from Cherokees as a whole, then it could be very significant and influential, right? So that possibility is there, which is why there was some fear about it. But the reality of the matter is that the freedmen, not as many freedmen as who could be citizens are actually enrolled as citizens. And they do vote in terms of their own interest as a group. They do tend to kind of like communicate with each other and try to vote to protect their interests. But they also are interested in protecting the interests of the Cherokee Nation, in other ways. They don't see their interests as being different. but they are a kind of minority within the Cherokee Nation that has some of their own specific political concerns. In general, that group tends to be more liberal than most Cherokee Nation citizens. They're a little bit more liberal. And if we're looking at like kind of, they tend to skew Democratic if we're looking at the kind of US politics, if that makes sense. And I think that was your last question. Am I right, Steve?
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
So could the Cherokee citizens decide that they're going to hold another special election and try to reverse that?
You mean try to reverse the recognition of the freedmen?
Right.
I don't, it's a good question, Ellis. Legally, I don't think so because of what happened with the federal court, because when the Cherokee Nation did not appeal that decision, it allowed to stand the federal court's decision that overturned the special election. So it would be kind of replaying that all over again. So I think at this point, they would not be able to do that, not without massive repercussions, because they would be in direct violation of the U.S. District Court. So it would be at their peril. So I think that kind of has played out and been decided, and they agreed to abide by the decision.
I mean, it seems like it could go to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, it's potentially it could go to the U.S. Supreme Court, I guess. But I don't know. Maybe Bob has a better. Yeah, Bob.
No, well, not just that, but the Cherokee Supreme Court did make a ruling after that U.S. District Court decision was not appealed. And it was a strange ruling, but essentially they ruled that that part of the Cherokee Constitution that said you had to be Cherokee by blood was not valid.
Mm-hmm.
And they said it was void ab initio, or void from the beginning. And essentially they redacted that by Supreme Court order from the Cherokee Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Cherokee Nation, which was on board with it, they almost immediately went online with the Cherokee Constitution and took that part out.
Yeah.
So if you look online on the Cherokee Constitution, you won't find that. I mean, it was actually removed by the Cherokee Supreme Court, and, which I think brings up a bigger question in law and politics. I mean, the reasoning the Cherokee Supreme Court gave was pretty much a laundry list of all the federal benefits the tribe gets that they would not get if they didn't do that.
Yeah.
And so they said pretty much for policy reasons, and also they said because of the treaty.
Yeah.
They did that, but they didn't really explain how the Cherokee Constitution could not be amended by a vote of the people, which it was. And they said you had to be freedmen by blood. And my understanding of constitutional law, at least U.S. constitutional law, I don't know if the Cherokee would necessarily abide by it, but to amend the Constitution, there's only two ways it can be done. It's either by a vote of the people or by a constitutional convention, not simply by the Supreme Court saying what you did was illegal, but that's what they did. And that's kind of the final say on that, Alice, is the U.S. District Court's rule. That's not been appealed, so that's a final decision. The Cherokee Supreme Court's made a ruling. So to change it, they'd have to reverse precedent, which I think would be cataclysmic.
Yeah. Bob, the other thing too is that if you look at the Cherokee Constitution, And the decision that was rendered by Stacy Leeds, I'm sure you've probably looked at it, but Stacy Leeds looks at the Constitution itself and the Cherokee Constitution itself, and the language says that people are citizens by reference to the Dawes Rolls, and it doesn't specify a by blood requirement in that original decision. So I think that, you know, it's interesting because the Cherokee Nation kind of tried to argue against that at various points legally. And so that's why in this most recent affirmation that happens in the Cherokee Supreme Court, they say it's really about the treaty. But there is a way of interpreting things based on the earlier Constitution and saying that the Constitution itself also doesn't say that there's a blood requirement. That only comes to be a later legal interpretation that has to do with these you know, additions that were made without a vote in the 80s. So I think this is one of those places where, as you well know, the law and the interpretation of the law is so fascinating, right, and complex.
Well, I also am really curious to hear, because you've touched on it some, but our conversation has kind of gone a different direction now, that, you know, like you said, Bob, and then this is my first time at one of our meetings, so I also just want to say thank you. It's nice to be with you all. I'm a recent join of our group. I live in Seattle. I'm here in California with my brother Paul, our grandparents in Watts, Oklahoma. I just found you all, so thank you so much. But I'm very much aware as we talk through this of the impact of colonization of our thinking. And in this conversation, we're kind of focusing on all of these ways that this problem has been that are actually all very much colonized ways in some senses of that. And to say that that decision is being upheld only because we don't want to lose our benefits makes me wonder, like, the reason the Constitution was written the way it was through the values of our ancestors. Values pre-colonization included adoption. Our values pre-colonization included diversity and embracing diversity, and that everybody who's a part of our community and our family and our tribe matters. So I mentioned it a little bit, Circe, but in the way our conversation has been just in the last few, I don't know, 10 minutes, we're not talking about like the value decision, the values that are our traditional values. I feel like an acknowledgement and a constant examination how our ways of thinking in our generations, we have done the deep work of re-educating ourselves and one another to our traditional values as our great us to have, you know? I'd love to hear a little more about that side of it.
So Tree, thank you so much for bringing that up. I think it's an incredibly important topic. It's something that I wrote quite a bit about in my first book called Blood Politics. And so one of the things is that if you look to, you know, the ways in which Cherokees reckoned one another from the earliest records that we have, we know that there was the story of Selu, the corn mother. And Selu would drop her blood onto the ground, and from her blood would spring forth corn, right? And so there was this notion that the very sustenance of the people was tied up with this idea of blood. But that blood was maternal. It went to the corn mother, right? And that was the Cherokee value of the matrilineal clan system, that you're Cherokee through your mother's line. Now we know that there's citizens who are Cherokee through their father's lines and that kind of thing, but that was the the traditional way of thinking was that it came through that matriline going back to the corn mother, right? And all of you somewhere have a Cherokee grandmother, you know.
Coming from?
I'm not really sure where that sound's coming from because everyone shows muted but you, Dr. Sturm.
Oh, yeah, I don't have any chips on me or a dog or
A bag of chips.
no.
Just as a side note, since I know I'm not the bag eater, but it's not about the story of St. Louis. I always think it's fascinating that the wild boy was adopted because he wasn't technically by blood through St. Louis or Constantine, you know, because they had the two sons and one from the river. And so
Yeah.
it's just it was a really cool piece in there, just as much as we have the blood of the corn mother.
Yeah, yeah. The other thing too is that there's also Cherokee stories that acknowledge that the father contributes bone. So the mother contributes blood, the father contributes bone. So there's this idea that semen becomes bone in the life of a child. And so there are matrilineal and patrilineal contributions, but I think the point is that I was trying to make was that in the early days, adoption, so you would see Black people being adopted in the tribe back in the 1800s, and the assumption was that through ceremony, they were fundamentally changed. They cellularly spiritually became a completely new being. They were remade as Cherokee. So it was a profound, it's not, you know, adoption is this kind of second class thing that you might think about. And I don't mean that offensively, but there is a way in which there's such, you know, a privileging of kind of birth families over adoptive families, that there's this narrative in U.S. kinship that sort of privileges blood above all else. But adoption was a very, very powerful force among Cherokees. So adoption is not something to be taken lightly. There was also a distinction made early on about whether people's mothers were Cherokee or not, right? And that's something that gets completely, you know, challenged. And whether the clan gets passed down, that's something that gets challenged by, you know, kind of patrilineal impositions from the you know, from white American society, in terms of, you know, there were accusations that the Cherokee Nation was a petticoat government, right? I don't know if any of you have kind of read that, but this idea that women were too powerful in the Cherokee Nation, right? So I think what you're bringing up is that, like, if you look to, you know, your ancestors, there are all kinds of ways of kinship that were more complicated and more profound in their own right and more nuanced in many respects than the way in which we kind of get more narrow definitions of like what kinship and what Indianness is about being imposed by the U.S. federal government. The U.S. federal government has an investment in making Indianness something that's more narrow. Can everybody hear me still? I'm getting some.
It benefits.
We can hear you. We can hear you fine. I do have a question on this one that's kind of a tangent, but when you were doing your research and stuff, I'm curious, did you find anything about talking about like where you have a Cherokee family that's adopted a non-Cherokee? So like my oldest son, for example, is not biological. I adopted him in. And one of my views is the fact is, I'm raising him, I'm teaching him, I'm trying to teach him language, culture, yada, yada, yada. He's my son. I mean, he is my son. And that's that pre-contact view of adoption that, you know, our sister just talked about.
Yeah.
And I would love it if we actually had the laws changed to be able to go back to that. But I don't know if that ever came up in your talks with people for identity and things. or if that was kind of grossly ignored.
You know what? There is a really interesting book. Have you heard of this book by Taya Miles called The Ties That Bind?
I have not.
Okay, so she's a wonderful writer, and she has a couple of books about Cherokee history. She's an African American woman who's married to an American Indian guy who's Gros Ventre, and she now teaches at Harvard. She's a beautiful writer, just an absolutely stunningly beautiful writer. So her books are very accessible. But her first book, she wrote about the Shoe Boots family, which was a freedman, a Black Indian family in the Cherokee Nation. And she does a very deep dive into their history because from that lens of their history and going back, she goes all the way into the earliest knowledge of any of their Shoe Boots ancestors to contemporary descendants. So she does this deep sort of genealogical look at this family. But in that, she talks a lot through the records about the power of adoption and Cherokee families adopting Black folks as relatives and then becoming full relatives. So it's, you know, just because they happen to be adopting Black folks doesn't make any distinction here. There's a long history of Cherokees adopting non-Cherokees and making them fully kin. And so that's great examples.
What was her name?
Taya, Tiya, is her first name, and the last name is Miles, Miles, and the book is called The Ties That Bind.
Thank you. I want to look into that.
Yeah, you'll find some good stories for sure.
Now, if only that would be the modern tribe would be influenced by that, but that's a different story.
Yeah. Well, I think being aware of what tribal governments are up against with this is where tribal governments are up against racist understandings of outsiders that impose definitions on who Cherokees should be and kind of muck around with, you know, the ways in which governments decide to, you know, make decisions.
And that ties completely with what I was. Thank you so much for advancing stories into this conversation. And I appreciate the neutrality actually with which you're presenting all of this, because we don't all have the same politics, right? And we're family regardless. So I appreciate that. I just also want to acknowledge that it behooves the agenda of the people who set out to completely annihilate our people generations past, you know, it supports the genocidal agenda, make our tribe as small as possible. So that's why I think it's so important that we as individuals, our families, and in our own clans, understand what civilization has done to our own thinking, and in the generations that have been experiencing civilization, some of our politics, a lot of our politics, have been influenced by the ways that colonization required us to act for our own survival's sake. And this is a new era. I think we have a lot more allies in power who aren't so interested in genocide anymore. And I hope that means that we can decolonize our own thinking and move out of that place where all we experienced was threat and violence and scarcity into a place where we revitalize our ancient experience and kinship.
Circe, are you aware whether or not the Cherokee Nation has ever considered changing the requirement that adoptees are not eligible for citizenship?
Not heard that debate. I haven't, which is, you know, yeah, that doesn't mean that somebody hasn't brought it forward and I just haven't heard it. I've only heard them holding that line.
Yeah, yeah, I've never heard any discussion of it one way or the other than that it's the requirement.
Yeah, there's much more discussion, kind of the opposite direction about the Indian Child Welfare Act than recognizing the historical precedent of adoption. But it's an interesting thing to bring forward,
Yeah,
a powerful thing to bring forward, I think, given history.
yeah.
It,
My own great grandfather, who was a white man, was adopted by the child back in the 1800s.
Uh-huh. Your great grandfather was white, was adopted by Cherokees?
Yeah,
Yeah, interesting.
I mean, a Cherokee wife.
does anybody know what other tribes do on this one? Just out of curiosity.
I think most there are some tribes that recognize adopted citizens as full citizens. I think they're primarily in the Dakotas, if I'm mistaken, but I think it's tough because you have the federal government Office of Federal Acknowledgement really being one that tends to kind of police ancestry as the primary criteria. And so tribes have to have a very long precedent of adoption as being, a kind of fundamental way in which they make kin to be able to fight that. But I do think there are some examples. I don't know those as well, so it's just I'd have to look up to find some references. But I think there are some examples in the Dakota, if I'm not mistaken. It's also interesting because if you talk to tribes from different places, there's often narratives about adoption being really important. So like if you talk to Kiowa in Oklahoma, they will say that they had to repopulate their people because of the atrocities of war and genocide through adoption, and that they went and gathered up, Mexicans and Texans and remade themselves after a lot of their population was killed off. And so, so Kiowas don't have an issue with sort of saying, yeah, we are all of these things, right? But there's a greater like kind of fundamental security possibly on their part about, sort of saying we don't doubt our Indianness,
Well, most tribes are more restricted than the Cherokees are, especially if they have casinos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well,
Oh,
great presentation, Circe.
well,
Okay.
just an aside, Alice, I was going to comment that since we're the Cherokee community of Puget Sound, there are some there's some tribes in Washington State that are somewhat actively disenrolling members. That's a controversial issue, and I'm not an expert on that, but that's going on with some of the Puget Sound tribes.
Yeah.
I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, there's a fair number of tribes, particularly on the West Coast, that have been engaged in disenrolling and banning members, and a lot of it has to do with casino money, and it's really deeply problematic. So it's another one of those examples where we see, things that are not traditional values really impacting the way in which communities are operating. So fortunately, that's not happening in the Cherokee Nation. And part of that is because the Cherokee Nation doesn't have per capita payments, and there's not that kind of tension happening. We've got that money being funneled back into the collective good, So that's something that kind of protects you guys, I think, from those nastier possibilities, right? But it is another version of this stuff. But I think it's just really about knowing history and being prepared to be good relatives and good citizens based on a deeper understanding of that history. That's what all this is, a kind of knowing this stuff is a calls for you to do that, I think.
often in the Northwest, people, I mean, it was just a regular practice. Tribes were smaller and geographically isolated because of the topography and because of the water. So who's 100% indigenous by blood, but not more than 20% of any one tribe. And therefore, any tribe. That happens a lot in our region.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I guess we're probably winding down. I don't know if it seems like people have kind of had their say and had a lot to think about and talk about today. And I know that I think we were supposed to have like a 50-minute presentation and then a conversation, but we just kind of conversed the whole time, which is the way I like it. So thank you all for letting me be sort of informal and just share with you what I know and all of that. And if anybody wants to ask questions and wants to be in contact, I know they put my email up in the chat, and so hopefully some of you got that. But also, you can find me really super easily online. Just I don't think there's another Circe Sturm anywhere so easy to find. And I appreciate this opportunity to get to share with you guys. That's one of my favorite things is talking with Cherokee people and you know, helping to educate when I get the chance. So thank you.
Thank you. Wado.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sturm.
Yes, thank you so much, and thank you for writing your books. I've read both of them, and they're great. So appreciate your work.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Yeah, Otto, enjoyed it. We'll see you. Bye-bye.
All right. Yeah, thanks much. Yeah, thanks for the conversation. Thanks.